Again. Welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2020. Today is June 10th, 2020. And the session today is actually the third and last synthesis session. And the idea is to try to synthesize the wealth of knowledge and information that we have been acquiring.
And you are breaking up?
Am I breaking up? Okay, I'll speak a little louder. And we need to synthesize all of this so that we can produce our communique. So I'm going to begin with a kind of summary of the what we've done so far. I will begin by sharing the screen. So see if this will work. Here we go. So we've had a number of tracks based on the question words in the in our logo. We had 2 sessions devoted to Whence. Then all of the sessions basically were concerned to some degree or other with what. Then 3 sessions on why, 5 sessions on how, 4 sessions dealing with use cases, and 3 sessions, but in those 3 sessions we had 10 panelists, 10 speakers, dealing with Whither. And then we had we've had 2 synthesis sessions already and some overviews sessions that have occurred throughout the summit, starting in the fall and continuing up until last week. So let me go over each of these. In Whence, we had 2 sessions. Chaitanya Baru talking about the NSF Convergence Accelerator Project pilot, specifically about Track A, the Open Knowledge Network, and the link to the slides is given in parentheses on each of these sessions. Then a week later, John Sawa gave us a very nice presentation on knowledge graphs for language, logic, data, reasoning. So we had, I think we pretty adequately covered the Whence topic. This is an excerpt from Chaitanya Baru's talk, one of his slides, that defines the Track A on Open Knowledge Network to some interesting goals of this particular pilot project. And it was interesting because it involved users in the research in a way that NSF projects rarely do. Then the why question was covered in 3 sessions, one with Hans Osman, then Matthew West, and then finally Ernest Davis. This was spread throughout. And Jan's talk was way back in September, Matthew in February, and then Ernest Davis was just a month ago. So interesting, a number of interesting ways of dealing with this question of why knowledge graphs. That's why they hit the hype cycle. Matthew West looked at business value, and Ernest Davis looked at why from the point of view representing time and space. Then we had 5 sessions devoted to how, the Anirudh Prabhu, then Hari Srihari, Spencer Reiner, and Christoph Yanovich. So this it's a really wealth of different techniques that can be applied to answering questions and analyzing knowledge graphs. Then 4 sessions on use cases, dealing with a number of topics in industry and in science, in manufacturing, and decision support systems. So again, a wealth of use cases that we have, our speakers have reviewed. Then Whither. Now in Whither, we had 1 session specifically devoted to Whither, looking at the future, and then 2 sessions devoted to standards efforts. So the first was on the 13th of May, and we had a number of contributors to that. Then a week later, Vinay Chaudhry gave us an interesting topic, the idea of an active, interactive textbook project to produce textbooks that are far more usable than current hard copy textbooks. It's an interesting prospect for how knowledge graphs can have an impact in the future. Then we had a second standard session with the 3 speakers, 3 panelists. One of them I think was really Lisa's dealt with the process whereby standards are developed. And then Barry told us about a specific standards group at ISO. And then Michael told us about standards and ontologies. And that session had some really lively discussions. Now, along the way, we also had various overview and synthesis sessions, which do help to kind of give us some idea of how to synthesize. But I think we still have a good deal we need to do to be able to fully synthesize everything that has been presented at all of these sessions. Accordingly, we need to talk about how we're going to divide up the tasks. What's the structure? Should we organize by tracks? Should we have some other organizational principle? Should there be some meetings associated with further synthesis? And then communique development is scheduled to start next week, and 2 sessions are now scheduled. So we need to discuss how we're going to proceed. And so I will now open it up to everyone. We're now going to have an open discussion session. Please join the chat room and enter your ideas. We're looking for synthesis ideas, okay, ways in which we'll be able to summarize, extract from all of what we've seen so far. Robbie, you are unmuted.
Yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think, Ken, frankly, you went way ahead of what I was thinking when I prepared this outline that you see on the chat board, but it does show the kind of thinking I had, namely, uh, first of all, about what are knowledge graphs. I said there is not a single one, so we should rephrase and answer this what question in the following way, that what are the different views of knowledge graphs? How different communities, different domain people, different researchers view and actual users use different types of knowledge graphs. And we had discussed four things, namely elements, theories, minimum essentials, and ontologies relating to knowledge graphs. So that is still open to include the the communication draft will include under what different views, if everyone agrees, different views with these adjectives attached to what are knowledge graphs views. Then um, I say not FIR, it's FAIR. How did we fare against Janet's suggested framework? Well, what people addressed in Janet's framework is adequately discussed today by Ken's slides, but we will need to go, it is coming later, which addresses what was covered. The number and topics of speakers you have already covered, Ken. Speakers' topics directly addressing KGs has to be still done because some speakers' topics were different than knowledge graph in the subject matter of the top of the speaker. So there are two questions here. How did the speakers address the knowledge graphs? Or if they did not, how did their topics of research connected to knowledge graphs? So now we need to discuss the content of the presentations, as you did bring out a few examples today, Ken, in terms of who said what. And I think we also ought to go a little deeper into their presentations and point out a few nuggets that relate to two topics which are the main theme of our discussion, namely knowledge graphs and ontology. I guess that summarizes what I was thinking on how we will proceed. And then would you please this time include more diagrams and illustrations? That is a question from me, because I think a picture says 1,000 words often.
Yeah, I think the diagrams are really very helpful. So are you proposing a different organizational structure?
No, I am saying in order for us to reach the content of the communique, we need to consider the above all points that I suggested, and then we analyze the topics, framework, and content before we outline the sections or tracks or topics for communique. So let us do a little bit of free session, maybe on 17th. If people are ready to do this homework, I will do mine and come up with what are the natural groupings of the presentations that lead us to fit things in Janet's framework or otherwise, and they become outlines of topics for communique. We can keep also working on the content of the communique because it will fall in one of these future suggested topics of communique or tracks of communication. Am I clear or am I confusing everybody?
No, you're clear enough. What was Janet has her hand up. Why don't we?
Good, Janet, thank you.
Yeah. So I agree with Ravi. I think the original idea of the questions was to make sure that we covered scope of those issues. I don't think we necessarily should follow those in the communique, in a strict sense of using those as if they were tracks. I think that so we need some looser approach, as Ravi is suggesting, to see what the content suggests for organization. Sort of have those in the background again, but the how, Ken, as you said, how was rich, and the use cases, which were our who, where, when, those were rich. Those sort of suggest that they will make a contribution on their own. The other questions are more, they sort of bleed into each other, and that's open to maybe picking and choosing from the presentations to not following the tracks per se, but seeing what we can find from the presentations for the other dimensions.
Yes, I agree. It would be good to come up with a new kind of organization based now on what we've actually seen. In fact, Mike Bennett pointed out that putting standards under Whither isn't necessarily accurate. And I think
Right.
if we're going, we shouldn't really start arguing about what those divisions are, because the truth is that placing those sessions into the different questions was to some degree a little arbitrary.
Right. Yeah, and I think it was useful, but it was just an ad hoc, heuristic device. I think that I like what Robbie had, different views of knowledge graphs, and maybe we go back to your questions that you collected at the beginning of. What was that? Did you have a list of questions in your original summary? They were assertions. So KGs are a vehicle for realizing the benefits of ontology engineering. And KGs combine existing ideas in a package that frequently works in practice to deliver value for large organizations. Might be interesting to go back and see whether we agree with these assertions. Have we gotten, maybe use those as an organizing framework rather than the track questions.
Yeah, okay, just a second. I will, I'm going to share the screen and bring those questions up. So this is on the Ontology Summit 2020 page on the wiki. And so, yeah, it would be a good idea to start examining whether, well, I think we have actually covered all of this pretty well.
Yeah, I think we have, and I think that gives another starting point for organizing the content.
Yeah, these are good for organizing content.
Kenneth?
Yes, Todd.
A slight reorganization. I do agree that trying to follow this prescription of what you're showing on the from the web page maybe not the best, because once you get into the who, what, where, when, why, that sort of, they overlap so much, it's going to be very difficult to separate them cleanly, and perhaps for no good reason. So what I would suggest is, if you start with the whence, what was the historical background that led to the use of these knowledge graphs, and then start talking about well, what are people doing with these things now? And one reason to do that is to demonstrate or show the diversity or confusion of an understanding of what a knowledge graph is. And then we can talk about, if we can, moving from specific examples to sort of the general problems that will occur because of the confusion. And then we get into the whither part, and here's where we can talk about how standards might help. And then also in the whither part, we can put forth what we think should be the accepted definition. And it's not a research challenge, it's just, this is what we propose after hearing all these different bits of information about the history and what people are doing and some of the confusion that's arisen and or the lack of interoperability because of that confusion. We think this is should be the accepted definition, and I don't know how we can blend that into the standards part.
Well, there are a number of standards efforts that we've seen, so
Yeah. So that, how to blend it
we
in, I'm
can
not
take
sure,
a look at those. And
that would be my suggestion for an overall structure.
okay. Right. Can you try to capture that, or should I just try to capture it from the recording?
Well, I did put some of it already in the chatty thing. I can try putting some more details there, and it may not be coherent or may not be entirely consistent with what I just said. You know, things change over time, nanoseconds, microseconds.
Yeah. Okay. So so that's very helpful. Then let's see, Mike Bennett. Oh, Robbie, you still have your hand up?
Yes, I wanted to comment on a couple of questions being asked on the chat. You think it's a good time, or I should wait?
Well, let's have those people who ask the questions
Yes.
speak, and then we can have a general discussion about each one. So who should start?
One is David Eddy, who started.
David Eddy, yes. Go ahead, David.
Well, I think my interest is in how can these things, however they're defined, help with supporting legacy systems, legacy software systems. I'll just limit it to software, even though humans are obviously part of systems, or systems are part of humans. I don't know. And my read is there basically, this is my own little hobby horse, and there is other than maybe Mike Bennett and Matthew West and John Soa, there is essentially no interest whatsoever in using or potential use of knowledge graphs in the support of the legacy software applications that run our lives, enable our lives. Any protests?
Would you like to categorize that as a research challenge?
No, absolutely not. I want to keep this as far away from research as possible. Academic research is, I have extremely negative view of that. This is
no, I mean like research and developing systems for supporting legacy software with knowledge graphs.
There's enough legacy silos already in place. Can knowledge graphs be put into place and put into use? I'd give a maximum of a month. 2 weeks would be better.
It's not really a research question, because there's lots of case studies of people already doing it, as we've seen.
Are they?
People are already doing this, right? Is that what you're saying,
Well,
Right.
that's
Michael?
all that presentation showed. So we should be able to relay what we've learned from those presentations in a section other than research, i.e. stuff that's happening.
Okay, good. So this actually is happening and we should report on it.
I would certainly be interested to see. I mean, because I see, unfortunately, Ravi's question here touches on mainframe COBOL. Incredibly off the mark. Incredibly off the mark. There are 50 major software languages, 1,500 minor languages, and a new language is introduced at the rate of one a month. Can knowledge graphs help support that flood of stuff? COBOL is just a major footnote. Anyway, my read is there is minimal interest in this forum for this topic. So I'll go back on mute.
Okay, great. Next, unless there's any other comment on this, we'll go to Mike. Mike?
Yeah, so I was just jotting down a couple of comments there. I think we agreed that the what, when, whence, whether, whither, etc., was for our organisation going in rather than for the sort of organisation and headings of the communique going out. So that's good. I'm answered in that. I like Todd's flow of starting with what we called Whither, probably calling it something else, and going from the history, then what's happening now, then somewhere standards, and somewhere then future directions, research challenges, and so on, under suitable headings to that effect. But I'm not sure to what extent any of the presentations we had cover some of those things. My previous comment assumes that at least some of the stuff we've seen shows what people are actually doing. Certainly we've seen a lot of that at the Knowledge Graph conference, a lot of that at the Stanford Knowledge Graph course, but I'm sort of fairly sure and kind of hoping that we also have some of that in our summit. So that's where we present, how it's being used to improve what happens in organizations, what happens in industry, in terms of whether it's integration or AI or natural language programming or processing or whatever. We should have some of that, what's the state of the art now, what's being done now. But I do think we also need a section on future directions for research, and not just research, but what can we expect in the industry, what are the new and interesting ways in which knowledge graphs are being applied, and where are those likely to go in the future. Maybe we need to make something up for that.
I think maybe we should, and there have been some interesting talks at the Knowledge Graph conference, which I didn't go to, but some of you here have. And then there was the Stanford seminar. And there was an interesting, at the last session, Mark Mewson proposed that knowledge should be regarded as a process. So it's kind of like when we were in the last summit for explanation. It was clear that explanation was a process, not a static thing. And Mark Mewson was proposing the same sort of thing for knowledge, that it's a process, which is interesting, and it's worth considering that as well. Todd, did you say something?
Well, yeah. Are we moving into epistemology, or are the reason for bringing that suggestion up from Mark was to suggest one of the reasons for the use of knowledge graphs in terms of their flexibility and dynamism?
No, I'm just making an analogy with the previous summit where we started off basically talking about what explanations were.
Right.
And it doesn't seem like that's what's happening here.
Oh, because is that the case because there is a more agreed upon understanding of what an explanation might be?
It seems so.
And the other part that makes it different is people are making knowledge graphs all over the place, as opposed to making explanations all over the place in the context of information systems anyway.
Right. So, but in both cases, there was a program, right? In explanation, there was the XAI program, and in
Right.
this case, there was the NSF Convergence Accelerator pilot. And I think we had a number of speakers who were involved in that. So that, in that sense, there was some analogous aspects of the two summits. But yeah, the fact is, it's really hard to give a definition because there's so much diversity in use of the words, use of what it means to be a knowledge graph.
Well, again, I'm hoping in this communique that we will recommend a particular definition that involves a coherent and well thought out, if you want to use the term schema, that's fine. And I also typed in my suggestion as to the organization, Kenneth. I think it
Good.
corresponds to what I had said, but maybe not.
Yeah, I'll check it. So, but I mean, among all of the, I didn't see any speaker that really addressed what knowledge means. I guess that is epistemology. So even maybe the concept of ontology, right, arose in philosophy. So it shouldn't be surprised that knowledge should also. What can we learn?
Right,
from this?
and Mark Musen's presentation, so that was the one where he was talking about what is knowledge, that we have a better agreement and understanding of what we're talking about with graph technology than what we mean by knowledge, and that the recent history of semantic technology and how the notion of ontology arose there was to be understood in terms of knowledge engineering, expert systems, world models, intelligent agents. You know, that's all really interesting for a sort of a rich history of the Whence, to see how semantic networks, which he also started with in the 70s, as sort of interwoven with developments in expert systems and AI, and then the idea of ontologies that was supposed to be a support for intelligent agents, and then the semantic web, and then the more recent KGs. So the history of both recent ontologies and KGs is, I think, comes out well in his presentation. And someone asked there, was it Mike? Can we make cross-reference? You know, can we sort of co-opt some of those presentations to fill in some gaps in our communique too?
I don't think we're limited.
I think the question, what do you want to pull out to put together, and how do you want to organize it? I think that's going to be the bigger challenge.
Right.
Right,
No,
so-
I like the way you have the organization. I just think that his approach to saying, let's take a closer look at what we mean by knowledge, and then looking from the 70s to the present, I think that was helpful without getting deep into questions of epistemology and ontology, you know, beyond the recent work from the 70s to now.
But I think the notion of knowledge graph was just a nice marketing gimmick that the people put on things. You know, they already had, if you go back and ask John, they already had semantic network stuff back in the 70s, if not earlier. It's only because the introduction of hardware and then the simultaneous growth of the amount of data. A lot of the work in this is based on the need for data management and the subsequent decision-making capabilities that are required or evolve from all that data.
Right. Well, actually, there was a knowledge graph initiative, I think, in Holland in the 80s. It was part of the general, AI, cognitive science, cognitive technology world, knowledge engineering. Someone typed that into the chat, correcting that this group in Holland in the 80s was the first to take the knowledge graph perspective. But that's, yeah, it's not knowledge graphs as a thing or knowledge graphs as a label that's really unique. It's more that these things are have gone through some cycles and some spirals of development since the 70s. I think actually ontologies, that was a point I wanted to ask, is that I think we need to look at both knowledge graphs and ontologies in this and show the history of them, the recent history of the two, and sort of, we foreground, the contrast or the complementarity between knowledge graphs and ontologies more than we have explicitly done. I think that would be really helpful in the communique.
Okay. That said, then, how are we going to do this? Who's going to do what, when? Do I have any champions?
Well, I can try to follow some of the outline I suggested, although some of it has been already discussed in our chat. So using the chat and the little bit outline I suggested in the beginning, I'd be happy to circulate or present in the next session what I found. It doesn't mean that that will be the content of the communique or even the bullet point organization around the communique. Communique should emerge out of our unbiased analysis of what we have discussed. But there are two topics people are asking in the chat that are not fully addressed. Should we be inward, namely look at what was done during this 1 year that we studied knowledge graphs? That means speakers, our own thoughts, our thought leaders' thoughts, our panelists' thoughts, etc. And then only stick to that in the communique. The second thread which is going on in chat is, should we go external? And I think that's where David said. David really opened my eyes to, I was thinking he's talking of legacy integration. He's saying so much is happening in software development world to which we are not addressing these present tools. Hopefully the tool generators are aware of that and are attaching it to machine learning or Python or wherever. But there are more wide areas that David suggests that, but those are external to what was presented. Should we include them as future challenges or as topics not yet covered?
No, there's no limitation in terms. The communique uses the summit as background material, but it is by no means limited to what was covered in those sessions.
But then the question will come, has the new thing that we are putting in communique, has that been harmonized with the community? Yes, the participants will review the communique again and again, and we do that for several weeks before we finalize it. So I agree with you that that becomes a part of consideration and discussion, but it was not formally presented in those sessions. That's all.
Yeah. So if you send me your slides, then you can present next week.
The slides would roughly follow the outline I gave in the beginning in the chat board. And
Right.
also I hope I am free to analyze the rest of the comments and thought processes that have come in the chat board
Great.
to correct my own outline and then work on that.
Okay, great. Now, Gary, you're next.
Yes, I have two or three quick things. I very much like the Stanford course on knowledge graphs and think it's very relevant. So therefore, I will try to abstract as much as I can into an outline from those presentations as input. Not everybody participated in those, but I think there's valuable material there. So I think for next week, I'll try to go through as much as I can and do simple summaries of what I found there so that we can look at that as a whole. The second thing is I think those people like myself who recruited a speaker should try to abstract some key points from each of the speakers so we make sure that what was presented has an opportunity to be represented in the communique. Again, I don't know where they'll go. For example, I mean, one of my speakers, for example, and talked about how we can sort of investigate what's in a knowledge graph, understand it, and what tools used to understand the knowledge that's there. So that's another thing. And I think the last quick point I would say is that we've had 2 synthesis sessions already, and there was a fair amount of chat in those. And I think there's some material in those synthesis chats that can also be leveraged for our communique. But this is sort of not necessarily saying how to write the communique, but to make sure that we're assembling some of the material that represents not only what we did, but what we understood, but also some parallel efforts like the Stanford group, which I think is valuable. And
Yes, that's right. We've had 2 synthesis sessions already. This is the third. Someone raised their hand but didn't show their name.
I believe that, and I've been actively trying to remove the
Eddie, I think.
request to speak. I wanted to add a comment into the comments, but it does strike me as interesting that the notions that are being developed in the world of network science have not found their way into really understanding knowledge graphs from a metric standpoint. And I think that may be a deficiency that at least I don't think I heard during the course of most of the presentations. I think that's very significant because it is a means by which knowledge graphs can be evaluated and evaluated mathematically, although perhaps not semantically, which I think there's general agreement is an imperfect science in the first place.
So do you have something that you can cite or present?
I could prepare something. I'm not, yes, I can do that.
So can you do that next week?
How about 2 weeks?
Do it in 2 weeks. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
A little overcommitted at the moment.
Send me your slides and I will schedule you for 2 weeks now.
Roger that, thanks.
Great, thank you. That's an interesting input. Who's next?
George, do you mean telecom? That meaning of network science?
No, I mean the use of applied graph theory to understand networks and their matrices, particularly as you get into, as is going on in Oxford, the notion of networks and dynamical systems.
But not as applied to telcos.
Well, it's certainly applicable, but it's well beyond that. It's well into the realm of almost every science. And
Okay.
we're discovering that networks live very much in parallel with Newtonian systems, and the two seem to get along fairly well, albeit totally diametric from a lot of perspectives.
Okay.
Okay, and who else we have here? Alex had a comment on that. Oh, Mark has his hand up. Janet and Mark. Janet?
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful if Gary could give the kind of historical context that Mark Musen gave on the question of what kind of knowledge are we talking about. It's and Newell's idea of the knowledge level. I think that was very grounding. I thought in the, I don't know, Gary, if you actually listened to that or if you just are familiar with it. I don't know if you listened to the whole class, but but I think that is really key, and that covers both discussion of knowledge graphs and discussion of ontologies, and some of the more technology-oriented and brand-oriented issues can sort of arise in addition to that history.
Yeah, Janet, yes. So I just put into the chat the link to the video where the last session, the 10th session with the 3 speakers, I found all of them worth listening to.
Yes.
Musen's is the middle one, the second one, and you can see
Yes,
his slides there. I don't know about
completely.
his getting his slides, but as I mentioned there, you know, he is going back. This is very much like what John Sowa talked about many times. He went back to Newell's knowledge level and said, now, what do we mean by that? Let's separate the graphical representation of the knowledge. What do we mean by the knowledge part of what's in there? And he talked about it as a performative. There was an interesting discussion around that, but I think that's the background. And
Yes,
I think
I put a link to his slides, a few lines up from your link to his video.
okay, good.
Yeah, and then the other, I agree with you on that last session, and Richard Socher's talk definitely got into the mathematics of reasoning over discrete entities. And so they definitely are using applied graph theory and matrix analysis. I think a lot of the presentations got into that. I'm not familiar with the Oxford work that you're mentioning, but you might want to look, George, at that. If you didn't see it, look at that video to see that presentation. I guess what was that, the first one in that video that Gary linked?
Fair enough. I think I missed that one, so that's a good insight. Thank you.
Okay, Mark Underwood. You're next.
Hey guys. So I think this fits under sentiment as opposed to recommendation, but when we framed this up as a topic for this year, it seemed like an applied topic to me. And so I thought we would have demos of knowledge graphs with practitioners who are using fairly widely accepted, usually Java open source tools like Neo4j. We didn't get that. We got what I think is numerous critiques of the approaches taken by the applied folks, which of course that's fair game. But I think a lot of that material reprises stuff from previous conferences and previous summits. And I just feel like this is drifting into a litany of complaints about what the current practices is with knowledge graphs as applied, and missing an opportunity to bridge the work that we do in the academic space to the practitioners that are using knowledge graphs. So, you know, partly it's because we reach out to the people we know and it's hard to get people from industry to talk about what they do, and they don't see themselves as ontologists. So this is seen as a, I don't know, if not intimidating, then exclusionary kind of group that we find ourselves in here. But so that's the sentiment, and I'm not sure how to solve it, because the material we got, often we had presentations here where the words knowledge graph weren't even present.
Yes, that's true, but I mean, at the Stanford seminar, they also had speakers that never talked about knowledge graphs.
Yeah, no, it's inevitable. And it's not that that's off topic, it's that knowledge graphs seem like an applied topic, and I guess it needs, for us, it seems to need to evolve into a more of an academic one, and maybe that's just where it needs to be for this group. But you know, for me, I kept looking for the Neo4j stuff that I could try at home, you know, that would give me some insight into what's being used in the social network analysis and in some of the applied areas that I'm aware of, and with the exception, possible exception of FIBO, you know, which I knew about before anyway. You know, I'm not seeing that. And so, I mean, I could try to survey that, you know, and produce some content for us based on third-party reporting about that. But, you know, that wouldn't be vetted by the valuable input from the other people here. So I think the quality wouldn't be so great.
Oh, I think it would be good. Would you do that? Could you do that for us?
Can I interject, Mark? I don't know if you had time for the Stanford presentations, but there was a lot of that there. If you want to, I'd put the general link to their website, and I think they changed their policies, so now the videos and the slides are available to non-students as well. So you might skim through the slides. There was someone from Neo4j who spoke
Great.
there. So you might want to summarize some points using those as sort of your, you know, what you draw from. Or
okay.
And the guy from Neo4j made a really interesting point about why graphs, why this, why has something clicked with the idea of knowledge graphs that has taken off. And he said that it has an advantage of bringing your conceptual model, your logical model, and your physical model into greater alignment, if you think in graphical terms. And so that's going way back, but then adding a little bit of you know, a new twist, and saying that that is something you can leverage. So just, you mentioned Neo4j, that reminded me, I thought that was a really good point.
Can I interject something there? I know it's not my term, but you mentioned why graphs. I had a phone call this morning from a political campaigner. I mentioned this word ontology in response to a call for experts to help them unpack some of the linkages between, you know, dark money funding and political actors and all of that kind of stuff. And just being able to describe to someone that if you're looking for visualization, you can use a thing called a graph, and you can integrate all the data from different kinds of sources using this mystery thing called an ontology, and start to apply visualization techniques that shows who's got relationships with whom and what kind of relationships those are. That simple business message really resonates. So that's another why graphs, outside of our friendly techie sphere of consumers, to the actual real world of politics and business.
Yeah, there, you know, at the seminar, there were a number of talks where they were showing, you know, how exciting all of this was, and all the customers that are really happy with their services, because, you know, a lot of the people at Stanford, as you might imagine, are entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. But when somebody asked these people, okay, what is the role of ontologies, they really didn't have a coherent answer in many cases. Yeah, other than, oh yeah, they're really useful. But exactly how did you use it?
Sad.
Well, that's something that we need to sharpen, is on, is to clarify that.
Right. I
In
think
light
we
of
have a
that
role.
issue.
We have a role to play here, and I think that this communique could be quite valuable as a result of this. And John has his hand up. We definitely want to include John.
Yeah, I would like to talk about the issues that I was presenting. I presented these issues in the Knowledge Graph conference in May. And then last week, I didn't sign on here because I was giving this talk at the Extended or European Semantic Web Conference. And I elaborated the graphs that I had for May with a lot more material there. And basically the point I make is that there is no difference at all inside the computer between a graph notation or a logic notation. None whatsoever. The only difference is how do you visualize it when you present it to people? And do you want to present it to people as a linear form, as a controlled natural language form, or as a graphical form? And which graphical form you have is irrelevant because you can map every possible, or I'll say almost every possible graphic form to exactly the same logic. So it really doesn't matter. The point is, for visualization and for language form, that's purely a human factors issue. Inside the computer, no difference whatsoever between graphs and logic. They're both identical in semantics. And I discussed this in those slides, and I mentioned this is for the ESWC, the Extended or European Semantic Web Conference.pdf, and I mentioned the slides there. And one thing that I say is that in section 2, I talk about DOL, that's that OMG standard, and they use common logic as the foundation for relating everything. They relate UML diagrams, they relate every notation for the semantic web to common logic, and they use common logic as the interchange format for mapping from one to the other. And so inside the machine, it's all the same. And then in section 3, I recommend the clip dialect. I mentioned that before, which is a very clean version of logic. And clip is easy to read for the RDF subset or the OWL subset. It's as easy to read as turtle or any notation you use for RDF. But you also have the option of going beyond that to represent first order logic, full common logic, and even extensions beyond that. And the point is that all of them can be interrelated. And now in section 6, used to be section 6, I now moved it to section 7, I talk about automated and semi-automated methods for relating these things. And these are supported by tools that you can download. Some of them are very popular tools. Others are more or less limited to one project or another. But these are tools that can be used for automated and semi-automated methods for deriving ontologies, merging ontologies, taking 2 or more independently developed ontologies and creating a merged ontology that combines them at a more at a level that's more underspecified, so that if you have multiple ontologies that are conflicting in one way or another, you can go up a level to derive an ontology that has just the underspecified level that is common to all of the ones below. And then the ones beneath the upper level, you can have more specialized things that are appropriate for that case. And one example I gave was the example of medical informatics. So for example, a physician, a general practitioner, a specialist in any particular field, a pharmacist, a nurse, and a patient may all talk about exactly the same case, but they have different viewpoints on it. They have different terminology that they use, but there is a commonality among them. And so if you can have an upper level that is common to all of them, but then you would have a different specialization for a general practitioner. Then say an orthopedist would have a different specialization from, say, internal medicine, or for brain injury, or for a pharmacist. A pharmacist would have much more about the drugs and the chemistry. And then you would go to your nurse, who would have much more about how you handle the patient and what do you do and what the services are. And then you have the patient's view, which is, well, talk about all of these people have to talk about exactly the same case, and they manage to interoperate by going to an underspecified level whenever they have to cross specializations. But then when two or more people who have similar specializations, they can dig down as deep as necessary. And so in those slides, I cover a lot of those issues, and the slides that I presented at the conference were about 30 slides, but then I extended them to about 50 slides to go into a lot more detail and with references and all. So I'd recommend those slides for anybody who's interested.
Okay. Brand said that he wants to share. So Brand, do you want to share the screen? Brand?
He seems to have logged off.
He's logged off?
He's not listed on Zoom.
Oh, okay. So that's moot. Okay. I'll try to get in touch with him about what he had in mind. All right. We have passed the end of the session, but we still have some hands up. Yeah, people are starting to leave, so I think we need to continue this discussion next week. Okay, is that all right, Ravi and Janet?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, I would suggest looking at those slides, because I put a lot of material in there, and there's lots of references for further reading on all of those systems that I mentioned.
Oh yeah,
Can I say
thanks.
one thing relating what John said to what George said, is that I think it's misleading to say that in the computer it doesn't matter. I think in the computer it's the mathematical perspective, the matrix-oriented, graph theoretic perspective that is important. That's aside from just the data collection and storage. But for the analysis and processing, it's the matrix perspective that is most important. And for the humans, just calling it a human factor is too disparaging, because it's for the humans.
I'm not disparaging anything. No. Human factors are the topmost, the most important part.
Okay.
Everything depends on humans. But the point is, it's irrelevant how you represent it inside the, it's irrelevant because every point of view can be shown. That's the whole purpose of that DOL standard. I think that DOL standard by OMG, that's very, very important. And the point is that they take all the UML diagrams, all the versions of the semantic web, and they relate them all to common logic and to any other notation you prefer. So anybody can choose any notation they prefer, and everybody sees exactly the same semantics displayed in exactly the way they want to see it.
Right. It sounds like DOL has basically resolved a lot of questions and would be good for future research in another topic. Okay.
Right, and it's already a standard, so it's and there's tools are available for it, and the point is that what I mentioned, I discussed DOL in section 2 of my slides, and in section 7, I discuss other software that can be used in conjunction with DOL. So the other software can be used for merging ontologies, deriving specialized ontologies, and the whole point I make is that the top level of the ontology has to be very underspecified. And that's one reason why I say that things like WordNet and Roget's Thesaurus are as good as any specialized ontology that anybody proposes. That the point is that the top level has to be underspecified, and then the specializations are at the various levels beneath the top. And all that's, I discussed that in section 7 with references to implementations.
Okay,
good.
so with that, I think we shall adjourn, and we'll continue next week. Thanks, everybody, and please join
Thank you.
us next week.
Thank you, Ken.